Okay, so I think we can get started. So welcome to everyone. My name is Andrea Presbitero, and I'm happy to host today virtual event at the Bologna Institute for Policy Research at SAIS Europe. Francesco Grigoli is here with us, and will present the Great Lockdown: Dissecting the Economic Effect, which is part of the IMF last World Economic Outlook, which has been released a couple of weeks ago. Before letting the floor to Francesco for his presentation, let me just take a couple of minutes to introduce the event. I'm very pleased to, first of all, introduce and host Francesco here, who is a colleague of mine at the IMF Research Department. Francesco has contributed and worked on a number of World Economic Outlooks, so has a lot of expertise on the policy-relevant research that is done at the IMF. And there's also a researcher and is published extensively on a number of topics, on several topics from income inequality to labor market outcomes to inflation dynamics, among others. So please feel free to check out online his work. Is really interesting. So moving to the chapter, I think that what Francesco will present is one of the chapters of the latest World Economic Outlook, and the chapter received a lot of attention when it's been released earlier in October from the media and also from the research community. And I guess the main reason it's because it's an in-depth analysis on how government mitigation policies, from restriction to public events to full lockdown, can affect the spread of the virus on the one hand and economic activity on the other hand. I think that clearly, like many of us who work on these issues, like in the past 5 to 6 months, like sorting out causality is a daunting task, and it's very hard. But I think the work done by Francesco and his co-authors is a good example of how state-of-the-art research can provide can discuss some and show some clear indication in the data, and more important, derive some very important policy implications. The most important implication, in my view, is that there is no trade-off between saving lives and protecting the economy. This is a message that I think comes out very clear from the chapter and from the work, and is also a message that comes out from other pieces of research. However, it also seems to me that it's not yet fully internalized in the policy debate. So I think it's very useful that we are here and listen to what the research tells us. So I'm very happy for that reason that Francesco can present at SAIS Europe in a time in which we are really, unfortunately, in the full-blown second wave, especially in Europe, and in the third wave in the US, and in which there is an ongoing discussion on how the government can contain the pandemic, and on the other hand, also minimize and contain the economic and distributional effect of lockdown and mitigation policies. So the rules of the game, Francesco, you have like 20-25 minutes max to go through the chapter and present the main results. And then we will open for questions. For the people who are attending online, for any question, please feel free to write them down in the Q&A feature of Zoom. And then after the presentation, I will open for Q&A, and I will read and try to condensate your question to Francesco. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Let me start off by sharing the screen right away. Tell me if you can see it full screen.
It's okay.
Perfect. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much again. And yes, I want to thank you, first of all the attendees, as well as John Hopkins University and you for kindly organizing this seminar. As Andrea said, what I'm going to present today are the main findings of Chapter 2 of the World Economic Outlook, which is a joint work with Francesca Caselli, Damiano Sandri, and Chen Lian. We also had the excellent support from two research assistants, Junjin Lee and Su. So let me start by describing a little bit what this is about. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has raised unprecedented health challenges, and these happen on a global scale. To contain the spread of the virus, most countries have resorted to stringent economic policies, and which consisted in non-pharmaceutical intervention, such as school closures, business activities closures, and sometimes even restricting people from leaving their homes except for essential reasons. Meanwhile, economic activity contracted sharply, And so in this chapter, what we are going to try to do is, first of all, to shed a little bit of light on the extent to which the economic contraction was driven by the adoption of these lockdown policies, and the extent to which they were driven by other factors, such as voluntary social distancing, which played quite an important role as a reaction to the fear of contracting the virus or spreading it. The second aspect that we're going to try to tackle here is whether we can expect a rebound in economic activity as soon as these lockdowns are lifted. If lockdowns were the main factor behind the collapse in economic activity, then lifting lockdowns would do the trick. But if voluntary social distancing is also an important factor behind the collapse in economic activity, then lifting lockdowns won't be enough, and activity won't jumpstart as long as the health risks remain unaddressed. The third aspect we are going to deal with is basically using some novel data. We take a look at whether there are distributional impact of lockdowns. And in particular, we're going to try to look at whether lockdowns affected differently different segments of the population. The idea is that there is a growing concern that lockdowns affected more heavily those groups of the population that were already more vulnerable to start with, such as women and the young, who have less stable jobs and less stable income to draw from during the lockdown period. Then we also provide some evidence on the effectiveness of lockdowns in containing the spread of the virus, which is really the main reasons why these measures are introduced. And finally, we are going to try to analyze whether there are some features of these lockdowns, such as the timeliness and the intensity or the stringency, which basically led to a better performance or a worse one. Let me point out that, again, addressing all these questions is not only important retrospectively to understand the nature of the crisis, but also to understand whether the strength of the upcoming economic recovery. So just a quick overview of the literature. As you can imagine, this literature is very dynamic. There are papers coming out still every day. In our review of what is out there, we understood that there is a broad consensus on the economic cost of lockdowns, and as well as on the effect of voluntary social distancing on economic activity. However, the quantification of these effects is still very much under debate. There is also growing concern that women and other segments of the population, such as the young, are most heavily hit, and this is something that we also relate to in this research. And finally, there is a variety of papers that are documented that lockdowns tend to reduce infections. So let me start by present some evidence based on cross-country data that lockdowns have a negative impact or are negatively associated with economic activity. So on the left-hand side here, we start from the simplest exercise. Basically, we are just correlating the lockdown stringency with the GDP forecast error during the first 2 quarters of 2020. And as you can see from the figure, countries that had harsher lockdown restrictions had also sharper contractions in economic activity. This is the first preliminary evidence that lockdowns had negative economic consequences. A natural question is whether these results hold also for other measures of economic activity beyond the GDP revisions or the GDP forecast error. And what we do on the right-hand side is we use GDP components as well as other measures generally used as indicators of economic activity, such as industrial production, PMI, and unemployment. And as you can see from the red bars in the right-hand side chart, lockdowns had clear negative effects on the economy in all these dimensions. And these conclusions hold even when we control for the COVID cases, just basically the number of infections, as shown by the blue bars. And we take this as preliminary evidence that lockdowns are correlated with a decrease in economic activity. However, to better assess the impact of lockdowns on economic activity, we now turn to panel regressions. And the key advantage here is that we can introduce country and time fixed effects, which help to control for those time invariant country characteristics, as well as for global shocks. And given how quickly the virus spread and how quick was the collapse in economic activity, we couldn't really rely on typical indicators of economic activity, conventional ones. Instead, we had to go on unconventional ones that are available at a higher frequency. And in particular, we relied upon two measures, the first one being mobility indicators, which measure the attendance at several places, as well as the job postings data, which measure just the stock of job openings. Now, the advantages of these two is that there were especially mobility data available for a wide range of countries, including both advanced, emerging, and developing ones. And job postings data, on the other hand, are available by sector, which provides another important angle to the whole discussion. So formally, what we do was to estimate this panel regression using local projection framework for over 120 countries. The specification has mobility on the left-hand side as a dependent variable, while on the right-hand side, we have the number of daily COVID cases to track the stage of the pandemic, and a variable to capture the stringency of the national lockdown, which is an index built by the University of Oxford. And as I mentioned, the regression also includes country and time fixed effects. Now, the real issue here, and also shared by other papers on the same topic, is that the effect of lockdowns on mobility is very difficult to identify. The reason is that lockdowns are generally imposed when a country is already entering an acute phase of the pandemic. And at that time, people are also more likely to reduce social interactions voluntarily because they fear getting infected or infecting others. So all this makes it difficult to understand the extent to which the decline in mobility after lockdowns is driven by government restrictions or by people behavioral changes. The identification assumption that we use here is that by controlling for the stage of the pandemic, we clean the estimates from the fear effect. The next slide, I'm going to propose another identification strategy which goes deeper to look at subnational level data. In the framework that I presented in this slide, using these local projections, we find a strong negative effect of lockdowns on mobility, which we use as a proxy of economic activity. And in particular, we find that in response to a full lockdown, which is an increase in this index from 0 to 100, basically featuring a stringent type of lockdown, including all the 8 measures that are contained in this index, we find that basically mobility falls by 25% a week after the lockdown is introduced. And this effect, however, tends to fade away over a month, but the reduction is due to the fact that also the stringency of the lockdowns tends to fall over time. So while we discussed so far that lockdowns are endogenous and the impact of lockdowns using national data, what we do here to alleviate the endogeneity concerns, we propose an alternative identification strategy that exploits subnational level data. In this case, the idea is to focus on countries that adopted national lockdowns instead of regional measures, and examine the impact on mobility in those regions that were less affected by COVID-19. This approach has 2 advantages. Basically, the first one is that national lockdowns were generally imposed in reaction to the epidemic in highly affected regions. And I think that Italy in this case is a good example in which the government imposed national lockdowns in response to a surge in cases in a few provinces in Lombardy. Therefore, lockdowns are largely exogenous to the conditions in regions that saw a low COVID spread. And second advantage is that the extent of voluntary social distancing was likely weaker in regions with lower COVID-19 cases. And this should allow to capture more easily the role of lockdowns in curbing mobility. So we use this approach on 422 subnational units for 15 countries. And basically we confirm the substantial negative effect of lockdowns on mobility that we also saw in the previous slide, which had national level data. And also the type of dynamics are very similar, despite we use less countries and subnational data. So we've seen so far that lockdowns have a negative sizable effect on the economy, but the regression, you may remember, also includes the number of COVID-19 cases, which allows us to understand if voluntary social distancing has an effect on economic activity. We do find that an increase in cases triggers fear that eventually leads to a decline in mobility, indicating that voluntary social distancing takes place as the virus spreads. Then we try to compare the effects of these two things, of these two factors, the lockdowns and voluntary social distancing, by computing the contribution of these two factors to the reduction in mobility during the first 3 months after the first case is registered. And for the full sample, we can argue that lockdowns and voluntary social distancing played roughly a similar role in reducing mobility. However, the share of the decline in mobility explained by voluntary social distancing is larger in advanced economies, where about 1/3 of the decline can be attributed to lockdowns. And this is likely related to the fact that in advanced economies, people have better chances to work from home and most likely have higher saving to draw from when they miss their salary. But what does it mean for the upcoming recovery? Well, since voluntary social distancing is important, removing lockdowns is unlikely to bring up economic activity to potential until health risks remain unaddressed. In fact, we find that the effect of lockdowns is weaker when voluntary distancing is stronger, which is when cases are high, as you can see on the left-hand side chart. And this is because when cases are high, people tend to self-distance, and lockdowns have a smaller impact. This also means that lifting lockdowns when infections are high is unlikely to provide a sizable economic boost. And this speaks loudly to the countries that will be tempted, especially during the second wave, to removing restrictions too early. To further corroborate the notion that economies are unlikely to quickly rebound when restrictions are lifted, we also ask ourselves if, given the harmful and sizable effect of lockdowns on the economy, we can expect that lifting these restrictions would lead to an equally large rebound in activity. And what we find is that easing restrictions does favor a recovery, but this is not as large as the decline in economic or in mobility that is observed when a tightening of these measures was performed. So let's say all the analysis that I've shown you so far focus on mobility as a proxy for economic activity. The question is whether these results hold also for other measures, other proxies of economic activity. And to answer this question, here we use the number of job postings data, the number of job postings from especially from Indeed, which is the job repository online. So as a first step, we replicate the local projections analysis that I presented earlier. But now the variable of interest on the left-hand side is the stock of job postings. And as you can see in the left-hand side chart, consistent with the results on mobility, lockdowns have a negative and significant impact on job postings. Second, as shown in the middle chart, infections also lead to a decline in job postings. So using these estimates, we recalculate the contributions of lockdowns and voluntary social distancing. And we see that they both played an important role in the decline of job postings. Indeed, data are particularly interesting because they provide job postings by sector, which allow us to confirm that both lockdowns and voluntary distancing are key factors explaining the drop in economic activity. So in this part of the analysis, what we do is to compare contact-intensive sectors, such as, for example, food, hospitality, and personal care, to less contact-intensive sectors, such as manufacturing. So in the left-hand side chart, we show that manufacturing jobs started to decline at the time of the national stay-at-home orders, which is shown by time 0 on the x-axis. These suggest the importance of lockdowns for this segment of the economy. Job postings data for contact-intensive sectors, however, started to decline a few weeks before lockdowns, suggesting the relevance of fear and voluntary social distancing in these sectors. Second, in the right-hand side chart, we do the same exercise, but now we impose time 0 at the time in which national stay-at-home orders were lifted. And we observed that jobs in all sectors started to recover slowly at the time of reopenings, but they remain well below pre-lockdown levels, suggesting that simply easing lockdowns will not jumpstart the economy if the health risks persist. So far I've shown you that lockdowns had severe effects on economic activity. Now we'll present some results about how these effects are distributed across different segments of the population. A first observation is that compared to previous recessions, the current crisis is affecting women disproportionately. And there are two main reasons for that. The first one is that the most affected sectors employ predominantly women. Think about, for example, hospitality and personal care, as we've seen before. And second, school closures have been particularly affecting working mothers, given their typical distribution of the child duties within the household. So to test whether lockdowns have the differential effect by gender, we use novel mobility data provided by Vodafone to track the percent of people moving in 3 severely hit countries during the pandemic, in particularly Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Another advantage of this data is that they're available at the province level, which allows for a much more granular analysis. And finally, also the fact that they are disaggregated by age, and this allows us to test whether lockdowns and different effects on different age groups. So to study whether lockdowns had different effect between men and women, what we do is to adopt an event study regression discontinuity approach around the time of the lockdowns. So in the left-hand side chart, I plot the percent of people moving in the age group 25-44, split by gender, around the time of the stay-at-home orders. We focus on this specific age group, 25-44, as the people in this group are more likely to have young kids. Each dot represents the mean of the data calculated over 20 equally sized bins, and time 0 is exactly the time of the introduction of the stay-at-home orders. So you can see that the mobility of both men and women falls sharply at time 0, but the mobility of women drops by a little bit more. The difference is moderate, is about 2 percentage points, but it's statistically significant. Then we want to dig a bit deeper and understand if this difference is driven by school closures or rather by women losing their jobs because of the lockdowns. However, for Italy and Spain, the time of school closures coincided with that of stay-at-home orders, but this is not the case for 5 Italian northern regions where schools were closed on February 23rd and national stay-at-home orders were implemented on March 9. So we repeat the same type of exercise, but this time, time 0 is the day of the school closure. What we find is that the wedge between the mobility of men and women starts to open up when schools close, suggesting that the ability of women to move is particularly affected by school closures, consistent with the idea that women carry a greater share of the childcare at home. Finally, we take a look at another dimension of inequality. We're interested in testing whether lockdowns have different effects on age groups. On the left-hand side here, you can see that stay-at-home orders reduce mobility of all age groups, from the very young to the elderly. At the same time, however, we note that those that are in the 65+ group were already moving less prior to lockdowns. We then test the impact of lockdowns on these different age groups in a regression framework. And what we find is that lockdowns have a stronger impact on the younger segments of the population. These results might have a further implication for inequalities as the young rely on labor rather than pension income. And moreover, young people tend to have less stable occupation, making them more at risk to lose jobs because of lockdowns. So let me now turn to the effect of lockdowns on infections, which is actually the real reason for which these tools are used. So to study the impact of lockdowns measures, we rely more or less on the same regression framework as before, the one we use for mobility. And again, we use both national and subnational level data. This time, the left-hand side variable, however, is not mobility. We have basically the log difference of COVID-19 cases. And on the right-hand side, we have the usual lockdown stringency, which is our variable of interest, as well as the lag of daily cases, which is the log of daily cases, which is used to track the stage of the pandemic. Now, we control for other factors that can be important for the spread of the virus, such as temperature, humidity, and as well as the amount of testing and contact tracing. We also include country and time fixed effects. So coming to the results, what you can see on the left-hand side chart is that at the national level, we find that lockdown reduced infections by about 40% with respect to countries that did not introduce lockdowns. And the timing to have these gains is about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, which is consistent with the time needed, the incubation period of the virus, plus the time needed for testing. The results at the subnational level on the right-hand side broadly confirm, despite here we use a different identification strategy as described before, broadly confirm that the decline in cases corresponding to the national level data results. So from a policy perspective, then, it becomes relevant to understand if countries that adopted lockdown measures early in the pandemic managed to control the spread of the virus better than countries that waited until the number of cases was higher. So this is particularly relevant in the current policy discussion as the virus appears to resurge in some countries. To differentiate across early and late adopters, we use 2 alternative criteria. The first one looks at the number of days that went by since the country registered the first COVID-19 case until the moment in which the country reached its maximum lockdown stringency. The second criterion is based on the number of cases at the time in which maximum lockdown stringency was reached. And what we find is that early adopters, as defined by these 2 alternative criteria, display better epidemiological outcomes 90 days after the first case. These results are also confirmed when we use a cross-sectional regression that controls for these other important factors such as humidity, temperature, and testing, contact tracing. So the natural question is whether lockdowns entail a trade-off. Our results about the effectiveness of lockdowns in reducing infections, if you couple those results with the finding that infections can considerably harm economic activity because of voluntary social distancing, provide a new perspective on the costs of lockdowns. So the prevailing narrative in the literature often portrays lockdowns as involving some type of trade-off between saving lives and supporting the economy. This characterization, however, neglects the point that lockdowns may lead to a faster economic recovery by containing the virus and reducing voluntary social distancing. And therefore, medium-term gains may even offset the short-term costs of lockdowns. In other words, lockdowns may help to pave the way for the upcoming economic recovery. Now, very last section of the presentation. So basically, the response to COVID-19 saw governments implementing different lockdown measures. In our research, we recognize that disentangling these effects is extremely difficult. The reason is simple. Basically, these measures were introduced in a very fast fashion, a distance of a few days one from the other, and in a very similar sequence across countries, which complicates, doesn't give us enough variance to estimate the effects of these single measures. So while we cannot say much about specific measures, we can still say whether it's best to rely on mild or stringent measures. And as you can see from the left-hand side figure, we find that the introduction of additional lockdown measures has a weaker marginal impact on mobility once other measures are already in place. So this suggests that lockdowns have marginally weaker negative economic effects as they become more and more stringent. For example, think about stay-at-home orders may only have modest economic impact if the government already mandated workplace closures. Conversely, we show that countries that imposed tougher lockdown measures early on ended up with less cases than countries that took longer and adopted milder lockdowns. So a possible interpretation of this is that preventing only a few instances of personal contact is not enough to contain the virus, such as, say, for example, closing schools alone, is not enough to reduce the community spread. So to summarize our findings, first, we have seen that lockdowns and voluntary social distancing both contributed to the decline in economic activity in the aftermath of the COVID-19 outbreaks. In light of that, what we argue here is that economies are unlikely to go back to full potential when they're under lockdowns if health risk conditions remain fragile. So in a context characterized by persistent health risks, it is critical to find ways to support activity while preventing the virus from spreading, such as, for example, enhancing working from home wherever possible, and as well as promoting new technologies such as contactless payments or facilitating the reallocation of labor towards less contact-intensive sectors. Second, we have seen that lockdowns tend to affect women and the young disproportionately, and to contain the widening of this gender and intergenerational inequality, measures such as unemployment benefits and paid leave for parents should be considered. Third, we have shown that lockdowns do reduce infections and are particularly effective when they are introduced early in the pandemic and when they are tight. So given the economic cost associated with these measures and the need to control infections, other policy measures need to be explored, such as the mandated use of face masks, cleaning protocols, working from home practices wherever possible. So finally, our last finding was that while lockdowns entail short-term costs, they can also pave the way for future economic recovery by containing infections which cause voluntary social distancing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francesco. I think it's really interesting. So, as I said, if I see there are already a couple of questions in the Q&A, but if anybody else from the audience has questions, just feel free to write them there. So I will let you some time to write, because maybe I can start with one question from myself, exploiting the privilege of chairing the session. So I think, I know I've been working there until very recently, so I know that it's a hard work doing all that so fast. Basically from when COVID started, working hard over the summer to get the results. But basically, what you showed is what you knew until I guess July or August, something like that, where situations were very good actually in Europe, and so maybe some people at least thought that we were on the safe side, more or less. Now the situation is much worse. So maybe I wonder, what can you say about if you have done any work more recently, and can you say something about what's happening right now, if you see any difference, or if you haven't done the work, because I know that there are the gaps to get the data, how can you try to generalize what you know from the current situation? And especially one thing I'm really interested in trying to understand, what do you expect from lockdown? Because I can see easily two kinds of stories. And you can see people that are, especially in Italy or in Europe, that are getting more and more tired. So the first time lockdown, where everybody will feel like heroes and we stay home, and now people are really tired about that. On the other hand, and so maybe lockdown is going to be less effective because people, comply less. On the other hand, you can also think that maybe there is much more fear than in the past. So at the beginning, there were still medics, doctors saying, yeah, it's but just the flu, nothing more than that. Now, I guess it's less likely. There are still some people like that, but we know that it's more of a serious concern. So maybe the fear could be a much more dominant element. And again, I'm in Italy now, so I'm thinking of the Italian context in which we are flooded by bad news day after day. There's no break in the media. It seems now we are doomed, and there's no hope. So I don't know if you can say something about that.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Well, as you already know very well, the schedule of the WIO, we stopped working on this basically in September, October, and at that time we used data until basically the end of July. This was also a hard constraint for some parts of the analysis because some of the data were provided by third parties. Now, having said that, yes, I mean, the situation might change. I mean, in the description of the results that we gave, we are careful to actually say that all our results need to be checked again once we get more data. Yet I think we can say something. I think we can say something relevant to the current situation, especially in the section of the results in which we speak about the timing and the type of the lockdown measures that work better. To say there is fatigue, but at the same time, there is also more fear because probably people realize that these things are not going away with the lockdown. So hard to say which of the two effects dominate. But what we can more safely say is that it's better to react fast rather than later. And I think this type of insight holds regardless of the stage of the pandemic, regardless of the wave in which we are at. Meaning that it's better to introduce lockdowns earlier rather than later. And it's quite clear in the results that the path that infections follow is completely different depending on the timing of it. And the other important result that I think still applies here is that these lockdown measures are more effective when they are stringent, but introduced over a shorter period of time. Having said that, we also recognize that it's not feasible to always introduce lockdowns. And that's why also we try to formulate policy recommendations that should accompany or should follow lockdowns or go with those, such as this mandated use of face masks, trying to introduce as much as possible contactless payments and try to redirect or basically the labor towards less contact intensive sectors. Not easy to do, especially in many economies in which, especially emerging markets and low income countries or economies that are dependent, say, on tourism or strongly contact intensive sectors. But at least I'm confident in saying that the two types of the type of findings that we have based on the timeliness and the intensity of lockdowns and the period over which they should be held should apply still for the current situation.
Okay, yeah, there is a question by Alessandro Merli, who is also at Johns Hopkins in Bologna, was very related, because what he says is that now that lockdowns are being reintroduced, most countries, at least in Europe, seem to be adopting milder lockdown and rely more on voluntary social distancing, which seems to be counter the conclusion of the study. So maybe you can say something on that.
Yes, I mean, it's a good observation. So far, the measures that are being discussed are milder. I think there is a little bit more conscience also compared to the previous wave. There is a little bit more information about how easy it is to transmit the virus, which might help. But indeed, I mean, our results suggest that the type of measures that actually work are early on and tighter ones, even though they're introduced for a shorter period of time. One thing that we didn't analyze and is very much under discussion today, for lack of data mostly, is what is the ability, or say, what are the effects of targeted measures, either across age groups or across geographical areas. And this is something that there is a bunch of work that has been done, and people also at the IMF that are working on these issues. Unfortunately, here we work with data through July, and at that time it was mostly national level lockdowns that were introduced.
Okay, then there is this question by Mirek Tobias, who says, was there something that you have found in your data that was truly unexpected for you? And what would you say is the most important insight that you have found?
Oh, well, I don't know about unexpected. I think maybe the most challenging part was how to square things using an index that measures stringency across different measures. As you can imagine, I mean, these are early findings of this type of literature that I'm sure will be followed by more research on specific measures. But at the time, it was extremely difficult to actually disentangle what school closures bring about that is different from workplace closure, just because these were implemented with a time lag of 2-day difference from one from the other, and with a very similar sequencing across all countries. So I would say, rather than unexpected, I would say the challenge of trying to disentangle things, which is where the interest of policymaker lies. and from the point of view of the insight, what I would say is that also what Andrea mentioned in his introductory remarks, the fact that the characterization of a trade-off might be a little bit misleading, given the fact that there is voluntary social distancing, and that voluntary social distancing is caused by the rising number of infections. So to the extent that lockdowns have an impact on the number of infections and therefore limits voluntary social distancing, well, I mean, in that sense, the trade-off is not really there. There are short-term economic costs for sure, but in the medium term, these measures may just pave the way for the recovery.
Yeah, no, I think that's very important, and I doubt that it's a very clear message in many contexts. I think, you know, given that, you know, there are, I guess, students also here, and you know, people that may have some interest in doing some research later on in their career. I think relating to this idea of like what was the challenge of the work, I think maybe can you say something about like the data, or the fact that, you know, you said in the presentation, like it's clearly like challenging moving from a situation in which we were all used to like, you know, click a couple of buttons and get some data on GDP and something else, at least for people doing macroeconomics more than microeconomics. And now you have to do sort of macroeconomics with micro data and sort of something that gives you like a flavor of real-time indication. So can you say maybe something on, you know, which are the challenges and where some of this data can actually found, because some of them are actually available. And I think it's a very important issue. And again, having seen the pandemic from both sides of the Atlantic, I think at least in the US, there has been a bit of an effort maybe from the private sector to show some data, and even some academics has done some work in putting together data. And I think at some point, if I'm not mistaken, having spoken with a bunch of your co-authors as well, you try to do something more on Italy, and then you basically clashed against the fact that there are no information. It seems to me that even now it's very hard to find good data to try to have some indication of what's happening. And for instance, like you mentioned, like targeted policies and schools, and there has been there was a PhD student who did something on schools in Italy, but again, like the concern is that we don't have like not even like something which is very basic, like but number of infected kids by school. It's not available, which seems to me like crazy in a situation like that.
I fully agree. I mean, I think that the good news is that for once there was, I think, sort of availability from the private sector side to share data on a very regular basis. I think the Google mobility indicators are a good example of that. They are very well organized, easy to use. So from the researcher point of view, are a great treasure. Similar data are the ones from Apple. Yet, I mean, as you can imagine, I mean, we are always looking for something that helps with all the econometric issues, especially identification. So when you go to subnational level, the world is completely different. What I think that it's currently missing the most is this ability to match the subnational disaggregation with other variables that have the same sort of disaggregation. Building, for example, the data set for the 15 countries that we have in the subnational level part of the analysis took us quite long, and the sort of disaggregation was not the same across countries. So the fact it might well happen that you have one country that is representing a large portion of your sample with respect to other ones. So there are all sorts of challenges involved in that. While the most recent advances or efforts from the private sector are very well received, I think that much more is left to do. And yes, I agree. And there are some things that sound crazy not to have, especially by age group. That seems to be an easy low-hanging fruit, at least. But this is the world we're living in. I think that we were very lucky to actually have access to Vodafone data, even though it was only for 3 countries. Unfortunately, this is proprietary data, but The big advantage of those data was that we were able to disentangle by age groups and by gender. So I think that efforts should be made to make this data available to the wider audience of researchers, even though it's not currently the state of art. For the other sources that we relied upon, I would say these are generally publicly available. The issue is that we often take data, say, for example, for the level of infections data by subnational units from different sources. So there is always an issue when you go to different sources. I don't know how harmonized they are. You would think that they should be easy to compare. It's just a number of infected people, but I'm sure that there is a lot of noise in the data. I think that an effort also there would be welcome in order to organize and harmonize the way in which these data are collected, at least within the same country at the subnational level.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I totally agree. I think it's very important, and at least at the national level, I really think it's something that the government should take on and do their job in collecting data. On the private, I like the analysis done with the Vodafone data. On the other hand, I'm a little bit surprised with the fact that you just have this data for like 3 countries and Vodafone, but it's not Vodafone per se, but like mobile providers, telecom providers are not willing to share much more, because for instance, like there is much more data available on credit cards. And, I think there's very similar issues on privacy, and these companies makes money and they care only about that. But being in a world in which like corporate social responsibility is very important, and it's very easy. Like it's basically, in my view, it seems to be like free advertising. Like you just give the data, especially to the IMF, but you give the data to some very well-established group of researchers, and your name it's all over, and you can say that you contributed like a very small part, but you contributed like the understanding of the pandemic. So I hope that will go. Maybe like in the few months, things will improve. I noticed that there is another question. So from an anonymous attendee. So let's see if I can read out loud or not. No, yeah. I found this very fascinating, especially given the short period of time. I'm wondering, do you think there is a limit on the number of stringent lockdown that an economy can endure before experiencing substantial adverse economical impacts? Yeah, that's a very tough one.
Yeah, difficult question to answer. I mean, well, what we can say is that we didn't really look at that because you can imagine we work with data through July. So we really had a few months of the pandemic, few months of data of the pandemic, and not so much variance, unfortunately, in terms of even cycles of stringency. I think it would be very, very interesting now to repeat the same sort of analysis with the current setting and the current situation in which many other type of measures are being introduced. Now, what we do find is that when we allow for non-linearities in the specification, therefore allowing for tougher measures or measures on top of others, what we find is very little additional marginal costs. So basically, you can tighten measures, but the economic costs associated to those are marginally lower. And good example is when you think about introducing a lockdown or stay-at-home order, it doesn't make much difference if later you also restrict public gatherings. And the idea is really that, I mean, the first one sucks in all the mobility variation that the second one might cause. And but at the same time, what we see is that these additional measures, one on top of the others, for higher stringency, do have marginal benefits in terms of infection reduction. So in short, what we see is that, yes, there are some non-linear effects which seem to go in a favorable direction. However, yes, we haven't looked exactly at what the question points to. And I think that more work is indeed needed to answer this type of question.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, I think we can close here, hoping that there will not be so much more work, and I understand from a research perspective, it would be nice to have more data point, but hopefully we will be done at some point. And also because I think, I'm worried that, at some point we can even change the outcome, the left-hand side variable, given that, there was this question about like how much you can endure, and then we see already like social unrest and something. But, okay, in the meantime, there is still time. There's another question by Alessandro who said, you briefly alluded to this earlier, but maybe you could clarify if you think regional lockdown makes sense.
Well, okay, I can't really. We didn't actually look at this in the wheel. What I can tell you is maybe something that I've been doing on the side on this topic. So we don't really have data. So what we did was to try some theoretical model out of it, and we were looking at what are the results when you impose optimal lockdown. And the literature so far, especially there is a paper by Asimoglu, which tells you that it's a win-win target, for example, older people. And a win-win in the sense that you confine those people that have a higher probability of suffering from complication or die out of the disease, out of COVID-19. And at the same time, the economy doesn't fall as much. However, in this work that we have been doing, we do find, in fact, that confining older people has better epidemiological outputs, because obviously you are protecting those that have a higher probability of dying. At the same time, and in line with the results that we have in this chapter, what we find is that when you would need to allow for a higher number of infections, because you are not confining the young who gets infected. So at that time, when you do not confine the young, people start to also feel unsafe about going out, and they refrain from social interactions. So basically you have this loop again in which higher infection lead to voluntary social distancing and the decline in economic activities. So basically in this work we have been doing, we find that when you confine the old, the number of infection is actually higher, and that limits and that causes more recession than what was seen in previous literature. I think that was the main insight. Also, there is always this issue about what if you confine a portion of the population, say the older, but then because of the type of restrictions that you imposed, you increase basically endogenously the number of contacts within the household, because people are confined at home, and then kids go home, and then you have this sort of, but now you have a higher probability of infection in the people that you have not confined, which may transmit to the people that are at home confined. So it's very difficult to confine people in separate places of the house. So another insight that we try to show in that paper is that whenever you basically, if the number of contacts, the contact rate increases across the two portion of the population that you're trying to confine through workplace closures or bans, well, if that number of contacts increases at home, then the optimal containment, optimal targeted containment is not too different from a blanket policy. And so there are all these aspects that are very difficult to model, but they are key to the results of this type of exercise that try to target measures across different segments of the population.
No, I think this is crucial, and I think it's important that people understand that any kind of this policy are extremely complicated. There are a number of intended and unintended effects, a number of feedbacks. Because again, I think the question came out probably because there's been discussion over the whole weekend about intervention of the young and or like isolating the older part of the population, and I think the discussion, at least here, it's extremely ideological. So like it's yes or no without even thinking about that. While I think it's very important to think about the question, try to understand where are the costs and where are the potential benefits, and weigh them. And I'm not saying that it's easy, but it's at least I think it's the direction to go if you want to have like a decent conversation and try to all go to find a solution, because otherwise it's just there is basically no discussion whatsoever, exactly because, you know, it's impossible. At least in my view, it's impossible to have a very strong view saying, you know, it's going to work or it's never going to work, or it's stupid or it's brilliant. So I think it's very important, and, you know, I think the fact that you say you do it theoretically, again, goes back to the question before, that we don't know much about the data. And I think another weakness maybe of dealing with the pandemic, the first phase could be that we could have used, at least in a situation like Italy or some other, or even the US, in which there is a lot of differentiation geographically about the extent of the virus. We could have experimented some of these policies in the good times, like over the summer here, like do some sort of lockdown, or like easing restriction moderately in some places and not in other, and do some sort of testing, even like opening the schools in over the summer in some places which there are no virus, so the risks are very, very low, and we can see what happens. And now instead we are in a situation in which we have to experiment in the worst possible scenario.
You raise a very good point. I mean, I fully agree. And again, I mean, as you rightly said, there are a lot of unintended consequences. And also for me, it's very unclear how, there may be nice ways to do it, but how do you get out from a targeted intervention? So once you allow the virus to spread in the non-contained portion of the population, at some point you need to exit from that. So what's the exit strategy? You allow people to meet and the virus to go basically from the non-contained to the contained one. It is not so clear, and it's very challenging to think about these things. But I fully agree with you. I mean, efforts could have been made before. Let's hope that now we can actually get it right.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, I think we have a message of hope, and I think we can close it here. I thank clearly Francesco for a very nice presentation and for staying with the Q&A session, and I thank all the participants and the attendees for being with us tonight, and have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much to all.